Chapter 8 of Prehistoric Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.K., Edison, New Jersey. Prehistoric Men by Robert J. Braidwood. Chapter 8. The First Revolution. As the incipient era of cultivation and animal domestication passed onward into the era of the primary village farming community, the first basic change in human economy was fully achieved. In southwestern Asia, this seems to have taken place about 9,000 years ago. I am going to restrict my description to this earliest Near Eastern case. I do not know enough about the later comparable experiments in the Far East and in the New World. Let us first, once again, think of the contrast between food collecting and food producing as ways of life. The difference between food collectors and food producers. Child used the word revolution because of the radical change that took place in the habits and customs of men. Food collectors, that is, hunters, fishers, berry and nut gatherers, had to live in small groups or bands, for they had to be ready to move wherever their food supply moved. Not many people can be fed in this way in one area, and small children and old folks are a burden. There is not enough food to store, and it is not the kind that can be stored for long. Do you see how this all fits into a picture? Small groups of people living now in this cave, now in that, or out in the open as they moved after the animals they hunted. No permanent villages, a few half-buried huts at best, no breakable utensils, no pottery, no signs of anything for clothing beyond the tools that were probably used to dress the skins of animals. No time to think of much of anything but food and protection and disposal of the dead when death did come. An existence which takes nature as it finds it, which does little or nothing to modify nature. All in all, a savage's existence, and a very tough one. A man who spends his whole life following animals just to kill them to eat, or moving from one berry patch to another, is really living just like an animal himself. The food-producing economy. Against this picture, let me try to draw another, that of man's life after food production had begun. His meat was stored on the hoof, his grain in silos or great pottery jars. He lived in a house. It was worth his while to build one, because he couldn't move far from his fields and flocks. In his neighborhood, enough food could be grown and enough animals bred so that many people were kept busy. They all lived close to their flocks and fields in a village. The village was already of a fair size, and it was growing too. Everybody had more to eat. They were presumably all stronger, and there were more children. Children and old men could shepherd the animals by day or help with the lighter work in the fields. After the crops had been harvested, the younger men might go hunting, and some of them would fish. But the food they brought in was only an addition to the food in the village. The villagers wouldn't starve, even if the hunters and fishermen came home empty-handed. There was more time to do different things, too. They began to modify nature. They made pottery out of raw clay, and textiles out of hair or fiber. People who became good at pottery making traded their pots for food and spent all of their time on pottery alone. Other people were learning to weave cloth or to make new tools. There were already people in the village who were becoming full-time craftsmen. Other things were changing too. The villagers must have had to agree on new rules for living together. The head man of the village had problems different from those of the chief of a small food collectors' band. If somebody's flock of sheep spoiled a wheat field, the owner wanted payment for the grain he lost. The chief of the hunters was never bothered with such questions. Even the gods had changed. The spirits and the magic that had been used by hunters weren't of any use to the villagers. They needed gods who would watch over the fields and the flocks, and they eventually began to erect buildings where the gods might dwell and where the men who knew most about the gods might live. Was food production a revolution? If you can see the difference between these two pictures, between life in the food collecting stage and life after food production had begun, you will see why Professor Child speaks of a revolution. By revolution, he doesn't mean that it happened overnight or that it happened only once. We don't know exactly how long it took. Some people think that all these changes may have occurred in less than 500 years, but I doubt that. The incipient era was probably an affair of some duration. Once the level of the village farming community had been established, however, things did begin to move very fast. By 6,000 years ago, the descendants of the first villagers had developed irrigation and plow agriculture in the relatively rainless Mesopotamian alluvium and were living in towns with temples. Relative to the 500,000 years of food gathering which lay behind, this had been achieved with truly revolutionary suddenness. Gaps in our knowledge of the Near East. I have very few sites and assemblages to name in the incipient era of cultivation and domestication, and not many in the earlier part of the primary village farming level either. Thanks in no small part to the intelligent cooperation given foreign excavators by the Iraq Directorate General of Antiquities, our understanding of the sequence in Iraq is growing more complete. I shall use Iraq as my main yardstick here. But I am far from being able to show you a series of Sears Roebuck catalogs, even century by century, for any part of the nuclear area. There is still a great deal of earth to move, and a great mass of material to recover and interpret before we even begin to understand how and why. Perhaps here, because this kind of archaeology is really my specialty, you will excuse it if I become personal for a moment. I very much look forward to having further part in closing some of the gaps in knowledge of the Near East. This is not, as I've told you, the spectacular range of Near Eastern archaeology. There are no royal tombs, no gold, no great buildings or sculpture, no writing, in fact nothing to excite the normal museum at all. Nevertheless, it's a range which, idea-wise, gives the archaeologist tremendous satisfaction. The country of the hilly flanks is an exciting combination of green grasslands and mountainous ridges. The Kurds, who inhabit the part of the area in which I have worked most recently, are an extremely interesting and hospitable people. Archaeologists don't become rich, but I'll forego the Cadillac for any bright spring morning in the Kurdish hills on a good site with a happy crew of workmen and an interested and efficient staff. It is probably impossible to convey the full feeling which life on such a dig holds. Halcyon days for the body and acute pleasurable stimulation for the mind. Old things coming newly out of the good dirt, and the pieces of the human puzzle fitting into place. I think I am an honest man. I cannot tell you that I am sorry the job is not yet finished, and that there are still gaps in this part of the Near Eastern archaeological sequence. Earliest sites of the village farmers. So far, the Karim Shahir type of assemblage, which we looked at in the last chapter, is the earliest material available in what I take to be the nuclear area. We do not believe that Karim Shahir was a village site proper. It looks more like the traces of a temporary encampment. Two caves, called Belt and Hotu, which are outside the nuclear area and down on the foreshore of the Caspian Sea, have been excavated by Professor Kuhn. These probably belong in the later extension of the terminal era of food gathering. In their upper layers are traits like the use of pottery borrowed from the more developed era of the same time in the nuclear area. The same general explanation doubtless holds true for certain materials in Egypt along the upper Nile and in the Kharga oasis. These materials, called Sibyllian III, the Khartoum Neolithic, and the Kargan Microlithic, are from surface sites, not from caves. Both Mlifat and Dr. Saulaki's Zawi Kemi Shanidar site appear to have been slightly more settled in than was Karim Shahir itself. But I do not think they belong to the era of farming villages proper. The first site of this era in the hills of Iraqi Kurdistan is Jammu, on which we have spent 3 seasons of work. Following Jarmo comes a variety of sites and assemblages which lie along the hilly flanks of the crescent and just below it. I am going to describe and illustrate some of these for you. Since not very much archaeological excavation has yet been done on sites of this range of time, I shall have to mention the names of certain single sites which now alone stand for an assemblage. This does not mean that I think the individual sites I mention were unique. In the times when their various cultures flourished, there must have been many little villages which shared the same general assemblage. We are only now beginning to locate them again. Thus, if I speak of Jarmo or Jericho or Sialk as single examples of their particular kinds of assemblages, I don't mean that they were unique at all. I think I could take you to the sites of at least 3 more Jarmos within 20 miles of the original one. They are there, but they simply haven't yet been excavated. In 1956, a Danish expedition discovered material of Jarmo type at Shimshara, only 24 miles northeast of Jarmo, and below an assemblage of Hassunan type, which I shall describe presently. The gap between Karim Shahir and Jarmo. As we see the matter now, there is probably still a gap in the available archaeological record between the Karim Shahir Leafhat Zawi Kemi group of the incipient era and that of Jarmo of the village farming era. Although some items of the Jarmo type materials do reflect the beginnings of traditions set in Karim Shahir group, there is not a clear continuity. Moreover, to the degree that we may trust a few radiocarbon dates, there would appear to be around 2000 years of difference in time. The single available Zawi Kemi date is 8900 plus or minus 300 BC. The most reasonable group of dates from Jarmo average to about 6750 plus or minus 200 BC. I am uncertain about this 2000 years. I do not think it can have been so long. This suggests that we still have much work to do in Iraq. You can imagine how earnestly we await the return of political stability in the Republic of Iraq. Jarmo in the Kurdish Hills, Iraq. The site of Jarmo has a depth of deposit of about 27 feet and approximately a dozen layers of architectural renovation and change. Nevertheless, it is a one-period site. Its assemblage remains essentially the same throughout, although 1 or 2 new items are added in later levels. It covers about 4 acres of the top of a bluff, below which runs a small stream. Jarmo lies in the hill country east of the modern oil town of Kirkuk. The Iraq Directorate General of Antiquities suggested that we look at it in 1948, and we have had 3 seasons of digging on it since. The people of Jarmo grew the barley plant and 2 different kinds of wheat. They made flint sickles with which to reap the grain, mortars or querns on which to crack it, ovens in which it might be parched, and stone bowls out of which they might eat their porridge. We are sure that they had the domesticated goat, but Professor Reed, the staff zoologist, is not convinced that the bones of the other potentially domesticable animals of Jarmo, sheep, cattle, pig, horse, dog, show sure signs of domestication. We had first thought that all of these animals were domesticated once, but Reed feels he must find out much more before he can be sure. As well as their grain and the meat from their animals, the people of Jarmo consumed great quantities of land snails. Botanically, the Jarmo wheat stands about halfway between fully bred wheat and the wild forms. Architecture, hallmark of the village. The sure sign of the village proper is in its traces of architectural permanence. The houses of Jarmo were only the size of a small cottage by our standards, but each was provided with several rectangular rooms. The walls of the houses were made of puddled mud, often set on crude foundations of stone. The puddled mud wall, which the Arabs call tuuf, is built by laying a 3 to 6 inch course of soft mud, letting this sun dry for a day or 2, then adding the next course, etc. The village probably looked much like the simple Kurdish farming village of today, with its mud-walled houses and low mud-on-brush roofs. I doubt that the Jarmo village had more than 20 houses at any one moment of its existence. Today, an average of about 7 people live in a comparable Kurdish house. Probably the population of Jarmo was about 150 people. It is interesting that portable pottery does not appear until the last third of the life of the Jarmo village. Throughout the duration of the village, however, its people had experimented with the plastic qualities of clay. They modeled little figurines of animals and of human beings in clay. One type of human figurine they favored was that of a markedly pregnant woman, probably the expression of some sort of fertility spirit. They provided their house floors with baked-in-place depressions, either as basins or hearths, and later with domed ovens of clay. As we have noted, the houses themselves were of clay or mud. One could almost say they were built up like a house-sized pot. Then finally, the idea of making portable pottery itself appeared, although I very much doubt that the people of the Jarmo village discovered the art. On the other hand, the old tradition of making flint blades and microlithic tools was still very strong at Jarmo. The sickle blade was made in quantities, but so also were many of the much older tool types. Strangely enough, it is within this age-old category of chipped stone tools that we see one of the clearest pointers to a newer age. Many of the Jarmo chipped stone tools, microliths, were made of obsidian, a black volcanic natural glass. The obsidian beds nearest to Jarmo are over 300 miles to the north. Already a bulk-carrying trade had been established, the forerunner of commerce, and the routes were set by which, in later times, the metal trade was to move. There are now 12 radioactive carbon dates from Jarmo. The most reasonable cluster of determinations averaged to about 6,750 plus or minus 200 BC, although there is a completely unreasonable range of dates running from 3,250 to 9,250 BC. If I am right in what I take to be reasonable, the first flush of the food-producing revolution had been achieved almost 9,000 years ago. Hassuna in Upper Mesopotamian Iraq. We are not sure just how soon after Jarmo the next assemblage of Iraqi material is to be placed. I do not think the time was long, and there are a few hints that detailed habits in the making of pottery and ground stone tools were actually continued from Jarmo times into the time of the next full assemblage. This is called after a site named Hassuna, a few miles to the south and west of modern Mosul. We also have Hassunan-type materials from several other sites in the same general region. It is probably too soon to make generalizations about it, but the Hassunan sites seem to cluster at slightly lower elevations than those we have been talking about so far. The catalogue of the Hassuna assemblage is of course more full and elaborate than that of Jarmo. The Iraqi government's archaeologists who dug Hassuna itself exposed evidence of increasing architectural know-how. The walls of houses were still formed of puddled mud. Sun-dried bricks appear only in later periods. There were now several different ways of making and decorating pottery vessels. One style of pottery painting, called the Samarran style, is an extremely handsome one and must have required a great deal of concentration and excellence of draftsmanship. On the other hand, the old habits for the preparation of good chipped stone tools, still apparent at Jarmo, seem to have largely disappeared by Hassunan times. The flint work of the Hassunan catalogue is, by and large, a wretched affair. We might guess that the kinesthetic concentration of the Hassuna craftsmen now went into other categories. That is, they suddenly discovered they might have more fun working with the newer materials. It's a shame, for example, that none of their weaving is preserved for us. The two available radiocarbon determinations from Hassunan contexts stand at about 5,100 and 5,600 BC plus or minus 250 years. Other early village sites in the nuclear area. I'll now name and very briefly describe a few of the other early village assemblages, either in or adjacent to the hilly flanks of the Crescent. Unfortunately, we do not have radioactive carbon dates for many of these materials. We may guess that some particular assemblage, roughly comparable to that of Hassuna, for example, must reflect a culture which lived at just about the same time as that of Hassuna. We do this guessing on the basis of general similarity and degree of complexity of the Sears Roebuck catalogs of the particular assemblage and that of Hassuna. We suppose that for sites near at hand and of a comparable cultural level, as indicated by their generally similar assemblages, the dating must be about the same. We may also know that in a general stratigraphic sense, the sites in question may both appear at the bottom of the ascending village sequence in their respective areas. Without a number of consistent radioactive carbon dates, we cannot be precise about priorities. The ancient mound at Jericho in the Dead Sea Valley in Palestine yields some very interesting material. Its catalogue somewhat resembles that of Jarmo, especially in the sense that there is a fair depth of deposit without portable pottery vessels. On the other hand, the architecture of Jericho is surprisingly complex, with traces of massive stone fortification walls and the general use of formed sun-dried mud brick. Jericho lies in a somewhat strange and tropically lush ecological niche, some 700 feet below sea level. It is geographically within the hilly flank zone, but environmentally not part of it. Several radiocarbon dates for Jericho fall within the range of those I find reasonable for Jarmo, and their internal statistical consistency is far better than that for the Jarmo determinations. It is not yet clear exactly what this means. The mound of Jericho, Tellus Sultan, contains a remarkably fine sequence which perhaps does not have the gap we noted in Iraqi Kurdistan between the Karim Shahi group and Jarmo. While I am not sure that the Jericho sequence will prove valid for those parts of Palestine outside the special Dead Sea environmental niche, the sequence does appear to proceed from the local variety of Natufian into that of a very well settled community. So far, we have little direct evidence for the food production basis upon which the Jericho people subsisted. There is an early village assemblage with strong characteristics of its own in the land bordering the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea, where Syria and the Cilician province of Turkey join. These early Syro-Cilician assemblage must represent a general cultural pattern which was, at least in part, contemporary with that of the Hassuna assemblage. These materials from the basis of the mounds at Martian and from Judaidah in the Amauk plain, as well as from a few other sites, represent the remains of true villages. The walls of their houses were built of puddled mud, but some of the house foundations were of stone. Several different kinds of pottery were made by the people of these villages. None of it resembles the pottery from Hassuna or from the upper levels of Jarmo or Jericho. The Syro-Cilician people had not lost their touch at working flint. An important southern variation of the Syro-Cilician assemblage has been cleared recently at Byblos, a port town famous in later Phoenician times. There are 3 radiocarbon determinations which suggest that the time range for these developments was in the 6th or early 5th millennium BC. It would be fascinating to search for traces of even earlier village-forming communities and for the remains of the incipient cultivation era in the Syro-Cilician region. The Iranian Plateau and the Nile Valley. From the base of the great mound at Sialk on the Iranian Plateau came an assemblage of early village material, generally similar in the kinds of things it contained to the catalogues of Hassuna and Judaidah. The details of how things were made are different. The Sialk assemblage represents still another cultural pattern. I suspect it appeared a bit later in time than did that of Hassuna. There is an important new item in the Sialk catalogue. The Sialk people made small drills or pins of hammered copper. Thus, the metallurgist's specialized craft had made its appearance. There is at least one very early Iranian site on the inward slopes of the hilly flanks zone. It is the earlier of two mounds at a place called Bakun in southwestern Iran. The results of the excavations there are not yet published, and we only know of its coarse and primitive pottery. I only mention Bakun because it helps us to plot the extent of the hilly flanks zone villages on the map. The Nile Valley lies beyond the peculiar environmental zone of the hilly flanks of the Crescent, and it is probable that the earliest village farming communities in Egypt were established by a few people who wandered into the Nile Delta area from the nuclear area. The assemblage which is most closely comparable to the catalogue of Hassuna or Judaidah, for example, is that from little settlements along the shore of the Fayum Lake. The Fayum materials come mainly from grain bins or silos. Another site, Merimd, in the western part of the Nile Delta, shows the remains of a true village, but it may be slightly later than the settlement of the Fayum. There are radioactive carbon dates for the Fayum materials at about 4275 BC plus or minus 320 years, which is almost 1500 years later than the determinations suggested for the Hassunan or Syro-Cilician assemblages. I suspect that this is a somewhat overextended indication of the time it took for the generalized cultural pattern of village farming community life to spread from the nuclear area down into Egypt, but as yet we have no way of testing these matters. In the same vein, we have two radioactive carbon dates for an assemblage from sites near Khartoum in the Sudan, best represented by the mound called Shahinab. The Shahinab catalogue roughly corresponds to that of the Fayum. The distance between the two places, as the Nile flows, is roughly 1,500 miles. Thus, it took almost 1,000 years for the new way of life to be carried as far south into Africa as Khartoum. The two Shahinab dates average about 3,300 BC plus or minus 400 years. If the movement was up the Nile, southward, as these dates suggest, then I suspect that the earliest available village material of Middle Egypt, the so-called Tassian, is also later than that of the Fayum. The Tassian materials come from a few graves near a village called Deir Tassa, and I have an uncomfortable feeling that the Tassian assemblage may be mainly an artificial selection of poor examples of objects which belong in the following range of time. Spread in time and space. There are now two things we can do. In fact, we have already begun to do them. We can watch the spread of the new way of life upward through time in the nuclear area. We can also see how the new way of life spread outward in space from the nuclear area as time went on. There is good archaeological evidence that both these processes took place. For the hill country of northeastern Iraq, in the nuclear area, we have already noticed how the succession, still with gaps, from Karim Shahir through Lefat and Jarmo to Hassuna can be charted. In the next chapter, we shall continue this charting and description of what happened in Iraq upward through time. We also watched traces of the new way of life move through space up the Nile into Africa to reach Khartoum in the Sudan some 3,500 years later than we had seen it at Jarmo or Jericho. We caught glimpses of it in the Fayum and perhaps at Tassa along the way. For the remainder of this chapter, I shall try to suggest briefly for you the directions taken by the spread of the new way of life from the nuclear area in the Near East. First, let me make clear again that I do not believe that the village farming community way of life was invented only once and in the Near East. It seems to me that the evidence is very clear that a separate experiment arose in the New World. For China, the question of independence or borrowing in the appearance of the village farming community there is still an open one. In the last chapter, we noted the probability of an independent nuclear area in southeastern Asia. Professor Carl Sauer strongly champions the great importance of this area as the original center of agricultural pursuits, as a kind of cradle of all incipient eras of the Old World at least. While there is certainly not the slightest archaeological evidence to allow us to go that far, we may easily expect that an early Southeast Asian development would have been felt in China. However, the appearance of the village farming community in the northwest of India, at least, seems to have depended on the earlier development in the Near East. It is also probable that ideas of the new way of life moved well beyond Khartoum in Africa. The spread of the village farming community way of life into Europe. How about Europe? I won't give you many details. You can easily imagine that the late prehistoric prelude to European history is a complicated affair. We all know very well how complicated an area Europe is now with its welter of different languages and cultures. Remember, however, that a great deal of archaeology has been done on the late prehistory of Europe and very little on that of further Asia and Africa. If we knew as much about these areas as we do of Europe, I expect we'd find them just as complicated. This much is clear for Europe as far as the spread of the village community way of life is concerned. The general idea and much of the know-how and the basic tools of food production moved from the Near East to Europe. So did the plants and animals which had been domesticated. They were not naturally at home in Europe as they were in Western Asia. I do not, of course, mean that there were traveling salesmen who carried these ideas and things to Europe with a commercial gleam in their eyes. The process took time, and the ideas and things must have been passed on from one group of people to the next. There was also some actual movement of peoples, but we don't know the size of the groups that moved. The story of the colonization of Europe by the first farmers is thus one of 1. The movement from the eastern Mediterranean lands of some people who were farmers; 2. The spread of ideas and things beyond the Near East itself and beyond the paths along which the colonists moved; and 3. The adaptations of the ideas and things by the indigenous forest folk, about whose receptiveness Professor Matthiessen speaks. It is important to note that the resulting cultures in the new European environment were European, not Near Eastern. The late Professor Child remarked that the peoples of the West were not slavish imitators. They adapted the gifts from the East into a new and organic whole capable of developing on its own original lines. The ways to Europe. Suppose we want to follow the traces of those earliest village farmers who did travel from Western Asia into Europe. Let us start from Syro-Cilicia, that part of the hilly flank zone proper, which lies in the very northeastern corner of the Mediterranean. 3 ways would be open to us. Of course, we could not be worried about permission from the Soviet authorities. We would go north, or north and slightly east, across Anatolian Turkey, and skirt along either shore of the Black Sea or even to the east of the Caucasus Mountains, along the Caspian Sea, to reach the plains of Ukrainian Russia. From here, we would march across Eastern Europe to the Baltic and Scandinavia, or even hook back southwestward to Atlantic Europe. Our second way from Syro-Cilicia would also lie over Anatolia to the northwest, where we would have to swim or raft ourselves over the Dardanelles or the Bosphorus to the European shore. Then we would bear left toward Greece, but some of us might turn right again in Macedonia, going up the valley of the Vardar River to its divide, and on down the valley of the Morava beyond, to reach the Danube near Belgrade in Yugoslavia. Here we would turn left, following the great river valley of the Danube up into Central Europe. We would have a number of tributary valleys to explore, or we could cross the divide and go down the valley of the Rhine to the North Sea. Our third way from Syro-Cilicia would be by sea. We would coast along southern Anatolia and visit Cyprus, Crete, and the Aegean Islands on our way to Greece, where, in the north, we might meet some of those who had taken the second route. From Greece, we would sail on to Italy and the Western Isles to reach southern France and the coasts of Spain. Eventually, a few of us would sail up the Atlantic coast of Europe to reach Western Britain and even Ireland. Of course, none of us could ever take these journeys as the first farmers took them, since the whole course of each journey might have lasted many lifetimes. the date given to the assemblage called Windmill Hill, the earliest known trace of village farming communities in England, is about 2500 BC. I would expect about 5500 BC to be a safe date to give for the well-developed early village communities of Syro-Cilicia. We suspect that the spread throughout Europe did not proceed at an even rate. Professor Piggott writes that at a date probably about 2600 BC, simple agricultural communities were being established in Spain and southern France, and from the latter region a spread northwards can be traced. From points on the French seaboard of the English Channel, there were emigrations of a certain number of these tribes by boat across to the chalk lands of Wessex and Sussex in England, probably not more than 3 or 4 generations later than the formation of the South French colonies. New radiocarbon determinations are becoming available all the time. Already several suggest that the food-producing way of life had reached the lower Rhine and Holland by 4000 BC, but not all prehistorians accept these dates. The earliest farmers of England. To describe the later prehistory of all Europe for you would take another book and a much larger one than this is. Therefore, I have decided to give you only a few impressions of the later prehistory of Britain. Of course, the British Isles lie at the other end of Europe from our baseline in Western Asia. Also, they received influences along at least 2 of the 3 ways in which the new way of life moved into Europe. We will look at more of their late prehistory in a following chapter. Here, I shall speak only of the first farmers. The assemblage called Windmill Hill, which appears in the south of England, exhibits 3 different kinds of structures, evidence of grain growing and of stock breeding, and some distinctive types of pottery and stone implements. The most remarkable type of structure is the earthwork enclosures, which seem to have served as seasonal cattle corrals. These enclosures were roughly circular, reached over 1000 feet in diameter, and sometimes included 2 or 3 concentric sets of banks and ditches. Traces of oblong timber houses have been found, but not within the enclosures. The second type of structure is mine shafts, dug down into the chalk beds where good flint for the making of axes or hoes could be found. The third type of structure is long, simple mounds of unchambered barrows, in one end of which burials were made. It has been commonly believed that the Windmill Hill assemblage belonged entirely to the cultural tradition which moved up through France to the Channel. Professor Piggott is now convinced, however, that important elements of Windmill Hill stem from northern Germany and Denmark, products of the first way into Europe from the east. The archaeological traces of a second early culture are to be found in the west of England, western and northern Scotland, and most of Ireland. The bearers of this culture had come up the Atlantic coast by sea from southern France and Spain. The evidence they have left us consists mainly of tombs and the contents of tombs, with only very rare settlement sites. The tombs were of some size and received the bodies of many people. The tombs themselves were built of stone heaped over with earth. The stones enclosed a passage to a central chamber, passage graves, or to a simple long gallery, along the sides of which the bodies were laid, gallery graves. The general type of construction is called megalithic, which means great stone, and the whole earth-mounded structure is often called a barrow. Since many have proper chambers in one sense or another, we used the term unchambered barrow above to distinguish those of the windmill type from these megalithic structures. There is some evidence for sacrifice, libations, and ceremonial fires, and it is clear that some form of community ritual was focused on the megalithic tombs. The cultures of the people who produced the Windmill Hill assemblage and of those who made the megalithic tombs flourished at least in part at the same time. Although the distributions of the 2 different types of archaeological traces are in quite different parts of the country, there is Windmill Hill pottery in some of the megalithic tombs. But the tombs also contain pottery which seems to have arrived with the tomb builders themselves. The third early British group of antiquities of this general time following 2500 BC, comes from sites in southern and eastern England. It is not so certain that the people who made this assemblage, called Peterborough, were actually farmers. While they may on occasion have practiced a simple agriculture, many items of their assemblage link them closely with that of the forest folk of earlier times in England and in the Baltic countries. Their pottery is decorated with impressions of cords and is quite different from that of Windmill Hill and the megalithic builders. In addition, the distribution of their finds extends into eastern Britain, where the other cultures have left no trace. The Peterborough people had villages with semi-subterranean huts, and the bones of oxen, pigs, and sheep have been found in a few of these. On the whole, however, hunting and fishing seem to have been their vital occupations. They also established trade routes, especially to acquire the raw material for stone axes. A probably slightly later culture, whose traces are best known from Skara Brae on Orkney, also had its roots in those cultures of the Baltic area which fused out of the meeting of the forest folk and the peoples who took the eastern way into Europe. Skara Brae is very well preserved, having been built of thin stone slabs about which dune sand drifted after the village died. The individual houses, the bedsteads, the shelves, the chests for clothes and ornaments, all built of thin stone slabs, may still be seen in place. But the Skara Brae people lived entirely by sheep and cattle breeding, and by catching shellfish. Neither grain nor the instruments of agriculture appeared in Skara Brae. The European achievement. The above is only a very brief description of what went on in Britain with the arrival of the first farmers. There are many interesting details which I have omitted in order to shorten the story. I believe some of the difficulties we have in understanding the establishment of the first farming communities in Europe is with the word colonization. We have a natural tendency to think of colonization as it has happened within the last few centuries. In the case of the colonization of the Americas, for example, the colonists came relatively quickly and in increasingly vast numbers. They had vastly superior technical, political, and war-making skills compared with those of the Indians. There was not much mixing with the Indians. The case in Europe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago must have been very different. I wonder if it is even proper to call people colonists who move some miles to a new region, settle down, and farm it for some years, then move on again, generation after generation. The ideas and the things which these new people carried were only potentially superior. The ideas and things and the people had to prove themselves in their adaptation to each new environment. Once this was done, another link to the chain would be added, and then the forest dwellers and other indigenous folk of Europe along the way might accept the new ideas and things. It is quite reasonable to expect that there must have been much mixture of the migrants and the indigenes along the way. The Peterborough and Skara Brae assemblages we mentioned above would seem to be clear traces of such fused cultures. Sometimes, especially if the migrants were moving by boat, long distances may have been covered in a short time. Remember, however, we seem to have about 3,000 years between the early Syro-Cilician villages and Windmill Hill. Let me repeat Professor Child again. The peoples of the West were not slavish imitators. They adapted the gifts from the East into a new and organic whole, capable of developing on its own original lines. Child is of course completely conscious of the fact that his peoples of the West were in part the descendants of migrants who came originally from the East, bringing their gifts with them. This was the late prehistoric achievement of Europe, to take new ideas and things in some migrant peoples and, by mixing them with the old in its own environments, to forge a new and unique series of cultures. What we know of the ways of men suggests to us that when the details of the later prehistory of further Asia and Africa are learned, their stories will be just as exciting. End of Chapter 8. The First Revolution. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey.
Chapter 9 of Prehistoric Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Prehistoric Men by Robert J. Braidwood. Chapter 9. The Conquest of Civilization. Now we must return to the Near East again. We are coming to the point where history is about to begin. I am going to stick pretty close to Iraq and Egypt in this chapter. These countries will perhaps be the most interesting to most of us, for the foundations of Western civilization were laid in the river lands of the Tigris and Euphrates and of the Nile. I shall probably stick closest of all to Iraq, because things first happened there, and also because I know it best. There is another interesting thing, too. We have seen that the first experiment in village farming took place in the Near East. So did the first experiment in civilization. Both experiments took. The traditions we live by today are based ultimately on those ancient beginnings in food production and civilization in the Near East. What civilization means. I shall not try to define civilization for you. Rather, I shall tell you what the word brings to my mind. To me, civilization means urbanization, the fact that there are cities. It means a formal political setup, that there are kings or governing bodies that the people have set up. It means formal laws, rules of conduct, which the government, if not the people, believes are necessary. It probably means that there are formalized projects, roads, harbors, irrigation canals, and the like, and also some sort of army or police force to protect them. It means quite new and different art forms. It also usually means there is writing. The people of the Andes, the Incas, had everything which goes to make up a civilization but formal writing. I can see no reason to say that they were not civilized. Finally, as the late Professor Redfield reminded us, civilization seems to bring with it the dawn of a new kind of moral order. In different civilizations there may be important differences in the way such things as the above are managed. In early civilizations it is usual to find religion very closely tied in with government, law, and so forth. The king may also be a high priest, or he may even be thought of as a god. The laws are usually thought to have been given to the people by the gods. The temples are protected just as carefully as the other projects. Civilization impossible without food production. Civilizations have to be made up of many people. Some of the people live in the country. Some live in very large towns or cities. Classes of society have begun. There are officials and government people. There are priests or religious officials. There are merchants and traders. There are craftsmen, metal workers, potters, builders, and so on. There are also farmers, and these are the people who produce the food for the whole population. It must be obvious that civilization cannot exist without food production, and that food production must also be at a pretty efficient level of village farming before civilization can even begin. But people can be food producing without being civilized. In many parts of the world this is still the case. When the white men first came to America, the Indians in most parts of this hemisphere were food producers. They grew corn, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, and many other things the white men had never eaten before. But only the Aztecs of Mexico, the Mayas of Yucatan and Guatemala, and the Incas of the Andes were civilized. Why didn't civilization come to all food producers? Once you have food production, even at the well-advanced level of the village farming community, what else has to happen before you get civilization? Many men have asked this question and have failed to give a full and satisfactory answer. There is probably no one answer. I shall give you my own idea about how civilization may have come about in the Near East alone. Remember, it is only a guess, a putting together of hunches from incomplete evidence. It is not meant to explain how civilization began in any of the other areas, China, Southeast Asia, the Americas. where other early experiments in civilization went on. The details in those areas are quite different. Whether certain general principles hold for the appearance of any early civilization is still an open and very interesting question. Where civilization first appeared in the Near East. You remember that our earliest village farming communities lay along the hilly flanks of a great crescent. Professor Brusted's fertile crescent emphasized the rich river valleys of the Nile and the Tigris-Euphrates rivers. Our hilly flanks area of the crescent zone arches up from Egypt through Palestine and Syria along southern Turkey into northern Iraq and down along the southwestern fringe of Iran. The earliest food-producing villages we know already existed in this area by about 6,750 BC, plus or minus 200 years. Now, notice that this hilly flanks zone does not include southern Mesopotamia, the alluvial land of the lower Tigris and Euphrates in Iraq, or the Nile Valley proper. The earliest known villages of classic Mesopotamia and Egypt seem to appear 1,500 or more years after those of the hilly flanks zone. For example, the early Fayum village, which lies near a lake west of the Nile Valley proper, has a radioactive date of 4,275 BC, plus or minus 320 years. It was in the riverlands, however, that the immediate beginnings of civilization were made. We know that by about 3,200 BC, the early dynastic period had begun in southern Mesopotamia. The beginnings of writing go back several hundred years earlier, but we can safely say that civilization had begun in Mesopotamia by 3,200 BC. In Egypt, the beginning of the first dynasty is slightly later, at about 3,100 BC, and writing probably did not appear much earlier. There is no question but that history and civilization were well underway in both Mesopotamia and Egypt by 3000 BC, about 5,000 years ago. The hilly flanks zone versus the riverlands. Why did these two civilizations spring up in these two riverlands, which apparently were not even part of the area where the village farming community began? Why didn't we have the first civilizations in Palestine, Syria, North Iraq, or Iran, where we're sure food production had had a long time to develop? I think the probable answer gives a clue to the ways in which civilization began in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The land in the hilly flanks is of a sort which people can farm without too much trouble. There is a fairly fertile coastal strip in Palestine and Syria. There are pleasant mountain slopes, streams running out to the sea, and rain, at least in the winter months. The rain belt and the foothills of the Turkish mountains also extend to northern Iraq and onto the Iranian plateau. The Iranian plateau has its mountain valleys, streams, and some rain. These hilly flanks of the Crescent, through most of its arc, are almost made to order for beginning farmers. The grassy slopes of the higher hills would be pasture for their herds and flocks. As soon as the earliest experiments with agriculture and domestic animals had been successful, a pleasant living could be made, and without too much trouble. I should add here again that our evidence points increasingly to a climate for those times which is very little different from that for the area today. Now look at Egypt and southern Mesopotamia. Both are lands without rain, for all intents and purposes. Both are lands with rivers that have laid down very fertile soil perhaps superior to that in the hilly flanks. But in both lands the rivers are of no great aid without some control. The Nile floods its banks once a year, in late September or early October. It not only soaks the narrow fertile strip of land on either side, it lays down a fresh layer of new soil each year. Beyond the fertile strip on either side rise great cliffs, and behind them is the desert. In its natural, uncontrolled state, the yearly flood of the Nile must have caused short-lived swamps that were full of crocodiles. After a short time the flood level would have dropped, the water and the crocodiles would have run back into the river, and the swamp plants would have become parched and dry. The Tigris and the Euphrates of Mesopotamia are less likely to flood regularly than the Nile. The Tigris has a shorter and straighter course than the Euphrates. It is also the more violent river. Its banks are high, and when the snows melt and flow into all of its tributary rivers, it is swift and dangerous. The Euphrates has a much longer and more curving course and few important tributaries. Its banks are lower, and it is less likely to flood dangerously. The land on either side and between the two rivers is very fertile, south of the modern city of Baghdad. Unlike the Nile Valley, neither the Tigris nor the Euphrates is flanked by cliffs. The land on either side of the rivers stretches out for miles and is not much rougher than a poor tennis court. The rivers must be controlled. The real trick in both Egypt and Mesopotamia is to make the rivers work for you. In Egypt, this is a matter of building dikes and reservoirs that will catch and hold the Nile flood. In this way, the water is held and allowed to run off over the fields as it is needed. In Mesopotamia, it is a matter of taking advantage of natural river channels and branch channels and of leading ditches from these onto the fields. Obviously, we can no longer find the first dikes or reservoirs of the Nile Valley or the first canals or ditches of Mesopotamia. The same land has been lived on far too long for any traces of the first attempts to be left, or especially in Egypt, it has been covered by the yearly deposits of silt dropped by the river floods. But we're pretty sure the first food producers of Egypt and southern Mesopotamia must have made such dikes, canals, and ditches. In the first place, there can't have been enough rain for them to grow things otherwise. In the second place, the patterns for such projects seem to have been pretty well set by historic times. Control of the rivers the business of everyone. Here, then, is a part of the reason why civilization grew in Egypt and Mesopotamia first, not in Palestine, Syria, or Iran. In the latter areas, people could manage to produce their food as individuals. It wasn't too hard. There were rain and some streams and good pasturage for the animals, even if a crop or two went wrong. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, people had to put in a much greater amount of work, and this work couldn't be individual work. Whole villages or groups of people had to turn out to fix dikes or dig ditches. The dikes had to be repaired and the ditches carefully cleared of silt each year, or they would become useless. There also had to be hard and fast rules. The person who lived nearest the ditch or the reservoir must not be allowed to take all of the water and leave none for his neighbors. It was not only a business of learning to control the rivers and of making their waters do the farmer's work. It also meant controlling men. But once these men had managed both kinds of controls, what a wonderful yield they had! The soil was already fertile, and the silt which came in the floods and ditches kept adding fertile soil. The germ of civilization in Egypt and Mesopotamia. This learning to work together for the common good was the real germ of the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian civilizations. The bare elements of civilization were already there. The need for a governing hand and for laws to see that the community's work was done and that the water was justly shared. You may object that there is a sort of chicken and egg paradox in this idea. How could the people set up the rules until they had managed to get a way to live? And how could they manage to get a way to live until they had set up the rules? I think that small groups must have moved down along the mud flats of the river banks quite early, making use of naturally favorable spots, and that the rules grew out of such cases. It would have been like the hand-in-hand growth of automobiles and paved highways in the United States. Once the rules and the know-how did get going, there must have been a constant interplay of the two. Thus, the more the crops yielded, the richer and better fed the people would have been, and the more the population would have grown. As the population grew, more land would have needed to be flooded or irrigated, and more complex systems of dikes, reservoirs, canals, and ditches would have to be built. The more complex the system, the more necessity for work on new projects and for the control of their use, and so on. What I have just put down for you is a guess at the manner of growth of some of the formalized systems that go to make up a civilized society. My explanation has been pointed particularly at Egypt and Mesopotamia. I have already told you that the irrigation and water control part of it does not apply to the development of the Aztecs or the Mayas or perhaps anybody else, but I think that a fair part of the story of Egypt and Mesopotamia must be as I've just told you. I am particularly anxious that you do not understand me to mean that irrigation caused civilization. I am sure it was not that simple at all, for in fact a complex and highly engineered irrigation system proper did not come until later times. Let's say rather that the simple beginnings of irrigation allowed and in fact encouraged a great number of things in the technological, political, social, and moral realms of culture. We do not yet understand what all these things were or how they worked, but without these other aspects of culture, I do not think that urbanization and civilization itself could have come into being. The archaeological sequence to civilization in Iraq. We last spoke of the archaeological materials of Iraq earlier, where I described the village farming community of Hassunan type. The Hassunan type villages appear in the hilly flank zone and in the rolling land adjacent to the Tigris in northern Iraq. It is probable that even before the Hassuna pattern of culture lived its course, a new assemblage had been established in northern Iraq and Syria. This assemblage is called Halaf, after a site high on a tributary of the Euphrates on the Syro-Turkish border. The Halafian assemblage is incompletely known. The culture it represents included a remarkably handsome painted pottery. Archaeologists have tended to be so fascinated with this pottery that they have bothered little with the rest of the Halafian assemblage. We do know that strange stone-founded houses, with plans like those of the popular notion of an Eskimo igloo, were built. Like the pottery of the Samarran style, which appears as part of the Hassunan assemblage, the Halafian painted pottery implies great concentration and excellence of draughtsmanship on the part of the people who painted it. We must mention two very interesting sites adjacent to the mudflats of the rivers, halfway down from northern Iraq to the classic alluvial Mesopotamian area. One is Baghuz on the Euphrates, the other is Samarra on the Tigris. Both these sites yield the handsome painted pottery of the style called Samarran. In fact, it is Samarra which gives its name to the pottery. Neither Baghuz nor Samarra have completely Hassunan types of assemblages, and at Samarra there are a few pots of proper Halafian style. I suppose that Samarra and Baghuz give us glimpses of those early farmers who had begun to finger their way down the mudflats of the river banks toward the fertile but yet untilled southland. Classic southern Mesopotamia first occupied. Our next step is into the southland proper. Here, deep in the core of the mound which later became the holy Sumerian city of Eridu, Iraqi archaeologists uncovered a handsome painted pottery. Pottery of the same type had been noticed earlier by German archaeologists on the surface of a small mound awash in the spring floods near the remains of the biblical city of Erech. Sumerian equals Uruk, Arabic equals Warka. This Eridu pottery, which is about all we have of the assemblage of the people who once produced it, may be seen as a blend of the Samarran and Halafian painted pottery styles. This may oversimplify the case, but as yet we do not have much evidence to go on. The idea does at least fit with my interpretation of the meaning of Baghuz and Samarra as waypoints on the mudflats of the rivers halfway down from the north. My colleague, Robert Adams, believes that there were certainly riverine-adapted food collectors living in lower Mesopotamia. The presence of such would explain why the Eridu assemblage is not simply the sum of the Halafian and Samarran assemblages, but the domesticated plants and animals and the basic ways of food production must have come from the hilly flanks country in the north. Above the basal Eridu levels, and at a number of other sites in the south, comes a full-fledged assemblage called Ubaid. Incidentally, there is an aspect of the Ubaidian assemblage in the north as well. It seems to move into place before the Halaf manifestation is finished, and to blend with it. The Ubaidian assemblage in the south is by far the more spectacular. The development of the temple has been traced at Eridu from a simple little structure to a monumental building some 62 feet long, with a pilaster decorated facade and an altar in its central chamber. There is painted Ubaidian pottery, but the style is hurried and somewhat careless, and gives the impression of having been a cheap mass-production means of decoration, when compared with the carefully drafted styles of Samarra and Halaf. The Ubaidian people made other items of baked clay. Sickles and axes of very hard-baked clay are found. The northern Ubaidian sites have yielded tools of copper, but metal tools of unquestionable Ubaidian fine spots are not yet available from the south. Clay figurines of human beings with monstrous turtle-like faces are another item in the southern Ubaidian assemblage. There is a large Ubaid cemetery at Eridu, much of it still awaiting excavation. The few skeletons so far tentatively studied reveal a completely modern type of Mediterraneanoid. The individuals whom the skeletons represent would undoubtedly blend perfectly into the modern population of southern Iraq. What the Ubaidian assemblage says to us is that these people had already adapted themselves and their culture to the peculiar riverine environment of classic southern Mesopotamia. For example, hard-baked clay axes will chop bundles of reeds very well, or help a mason dress his unbaked mud bricks, and there were only a few soft and pithy species of trees available. The Ubaidian levels of Eridu yield quantities of date pits. That excellent and characteristically Iraqi fruit was already in use. The excavators also found the clay model of a ship, with the stepping point for a mast, so that Sinbad the sailor must have had his antecedents as early as the time of Ubaid. The bones of fish, which must have flourished in the larger canals as well as in the rivers, are common in the Ubaidian levels and thereafter. The Ubaidian achievement. On present evidence, my tendency is to see the Ubaidian assemblage in southern Iraq as the trace of a new era. I wish there were more evidence, but what we have suggests this to me. The culture of southern Ubaid soon became a culture of towns, of centrally located towns with some rural villages about them. The town had a temple, and there must have been priests. These priests probably had political and economic functions, as well as religious ones, if the somewhat later history of Mesopotamia may suggest a pattern for us. Presently the temple and its priesthood were possibly the focus of the market. The temple received its due, and may already have had its own lands and herds and flocks. The people of the town undoubtedly, at least in consultation with the temple administration, planned and maintained the simple irrigation ditches. As the system flourished, the community of rural farmers would have produced more than sufficient food. The tendency for specialized crafts to develop, tentative at best at the cultural level of the earlier village farming community era, would now have been achieved, and probably many other specialists in temple administration, water control, architecture, and trade would also have appeared, as the surplus food supply was assured. Southern Mesopotamia is not a land rich in natural resources other than its fertile soil. Stone, good wood for construction, metal, and innumerable other things would have had to be imported. Grain and dates, although both were bulky and difficult to transport, and wool and woven stuffs must have been the mediums of exchange. Over what area did the trading network of Ubaid extend? We start with the idea that the Ubaidian assemblage is most richly developed in the south. We assume, I think correctly, that it represents a cultural flowering of the south. On the basis of the pottery of the still elusive Eridu immigrants who had first followed the rivers into alluvial Mesopotamia, we get the notion that the characteristic painted pottery style of Ubaid was developed in the Southland. If this reconstruction is correct, then we may watch with interest where the Ubaid pottery painting tradition spread. We have already mentioned that there is substantial assemblage of, and from the southern point of view fairly pure, Ubaidian material in northern Iraq. The pottery appears all along the Iranian flanks, even well east of the head of the Persian Gulf, and ends in a later and spectacular flourish in an extremely handsome painted style called the Susa style. Ubaidian pottery has been noted up the valleys of both of the great rivers, well north of the Iraqi and Syrian borders on the southern flanks of the Anatolian plateau. It reaches the Mediterranean Sea and the valley of the Orontes in Syria, and it may be faintly reflected in the painted style of a site called Ghassul, on the east bank of the Jordan in the Dead Sea Valley. Over this vast area, certainly in all of the great basin of the Tigris-Euphrates drainage system and its natural extensions, I believe we may lay our fingers on the traces of a peculiar way of decorating pottery which we call Ubaidian. This cursive and even slapdash decoration, it appears to me, was part of a new cultural tradition which arose from the adjustments which immigrant northern farmers first made to the new and challenging environment of southern Mesopotamia. But exciting as the idea of the spread of influences of the Ubaid tradition in space may be, I believe you will agree that the consequences of the growth of that tradition in southern Mesopotamia itself as time passed are even more important. The Warka phase in the south. So far, there are only two radiocarbon determinations for the Ubaidian assemblage, one from Tepe Gawra in the north and one from Warka in the south. My hunch would be to use the dates 4500 to 3750 BC with a plus or more probably a minus factor of about 200 years for each as the time duration of the Ubaidian assemblage in southern Mesopotamia. Next, much to our annoyance, we have what is almost a temporary blackout. According to the system of terminology I favor, our next assemblage, after that of Ubaid, is called the Warka phase, from the Arabic name for the site of Uruk or Erech. We know it only from 6 or 7 levels in a narrow test pit at Warka, and from an even smaller hole at another site. This assemblage, so far, is known only by its pottery, some of which still bears Ubaidian style painting. The characteristic Warkan pottery is unpainted, with smoothed red or gray surfaces and peculiar shapes. Unquestionably, there must be a great deal more to say about the Warkan assemblage, but someone will first have to excavate it. The dawn of civilization. After our exasperation with the almost unknown Warka interlude, following the brilliant false dawn of Ubaid, we move next to an assemblage which yields traces of a preponderance of those elements which we noted as meaning civilization. This assemblage is that called Proto-Literate. It already contains writing. On the somewhat shaky principle that writing, however early, means history, and no longer prehistory, the assemblage is named for the historical implications of its content, and no longer after the name of the site where it was first found. Since some of the older books used site names for this assemblage, I will tell you that the Proto-Literate includes the latter half of what used to be called the Uruk period, plus all of what used to be called the Jemdet Nasr period. It shows a consistent development from beginning to end. I shall, in fact, leave much of the description and the historic implications of the Proto-Literate assemblage to the conventional historians. Professor T.J. Jacobson, reaching backward from the legends he finds in the cuneiform writings of slightly later times, can in fact tell you a more complete story of Proto-Literate culture than I can. It should be enough here if I sum up briefly what the excavated archaeological evidence shows. We have yet to dig a Proto-Literate site in its entirety, but the indications are that the sites cover areas the size of small cities. In architecture, we know of large and monumental temple structures, which were built on elaborate high terraces. The plans and decoration of these temples follow the pattern set in the Ubaid phase. The chief difference is one of size. The German excavators at the site of Warka reckoned that the construction of only one of the Proto-Literate temple complexes there must have taken 1,500 men each working a 10-hour day, 5 years to build. Art and writing. If the architecture, even in its monumental forms, can be seen to stem from Ubaidian developments, this is not so with our other evidence of Proto-Literate artistic expression. In relief and applied sculpture, in sculpture in the round, and on the engraved cylinder sills, all of which now make their appearance, several completely new artistic principles are apparent. These include the composition of subject matter in groups, commemorative scenes, and especially the ability and apparent desire to render the human form and face. Excellent as the animals of the Franco-Cantabrian art may have been, and however handsome were the carefully drafted geometric designs and conventionalized figures on the pottery of the early farmers, there seems to have been up to this time a mental block about the drawing of the human figure, and especially the human face. We do not yet know what caused this self-consciousness about picturing themselves, which seems characteristic of men before the appearance of civilization. We do know that with civilization the mental block seems to have been removed. Clay tablets bearing pictographic signs are the proto-literate forerunners of cuneiform writing. The earliest examples are not well understood, but they seem to be devices for making accounts and for remembering accounts. Different from the later case in Egypt, where writing appears fully formed in the earliest examples, the development from simple pictographic signs to proper cuneiform writing may be traced step by step in Mesopotamia. It is most probable that the development of writing was connected with the temple and the need for keeping account of the temple's possessions. Professor Jacobson sees writing as a means for overcoming space, time, and the increasing complications of human affairs. Literacy, which began with civilization, enhanced mightily those very tendencies in its development which characterize it as a civilization, and mark it off as such from other types of culture. While the new principles in art and the idea of writing are not foreshadowed in the Ubaid phase or in what little we know of the Warkan, I do not think we need to look outside southern Mesopotamia for their beginnings. We do know something of the adjacent areas too, and these beginnings are not there. I think we must accept them as completely new discoveries made by the people who were developing the whole new culture pattern of classic southern Mesopotamia. Full description of the art, architecture, and writing of the Proto-Literate phase would call for many details. Men like Professor Jacobson and Dr. Adams can give you these details much better than I can. Nor shall I do more than tell you that the common pottery of the Proto-Literate phase was so well standardized that it looks factory-made. There was also some handsome painted pottery, and there were stone bowls with inlaid decoration. Well-made tools in metal had by now become fairly common, and the metallurgist was experimenting with the casting process. Signs for plows have been identified in the early pictographs, and a wheeled chariot is shown on a cylinder seal engraving. But if I were forced to a guess in the matter, I would say that the development of plows and draft animals probably began in the Ubaid period, and was another of the great innovations of that time. The Proto-Literate assemblage clearly suggests a highly developed and sophisticated culture. While perhaps not yet fully urban, it is on the threshold of urbanization. There seems to have been a very dense settlement of Proto-Literate sites in classic southern Mesopotamia, many of them newly founded on virgin soil, where no earlier settlements had been. When we think for a moment of what all this implies, of the growth of an irrigation system which must have existed to allow the flourish of this culture, and of the social and political organization necessary to maintain the irrigation system, I think we will agree that at last we are dealing with civilization proper. From prehistory to history. Now it is time for the conventional ancient historians to take over the story from me. Remember, this is when you read what they write. Their real baseline is the cultures ruled over by later kings and emperors, whose writings describe military campaigns and the administration of laws and fully organized trading ventures. To these historians, the Proto-Literate phase is still a simple beginning for what is to follow. If they mention the Ubaid assemblage at all, the one I was so lyrical about, it will be as some dim and fumbling step on the path to the civilized way of life. I suppose you could say that the difference in the approach is that as a prehistorian I have been looking forward or upward in time, while the historians look backward to glimpse what I've been describing here. My baseline was 500,000 years ago, with a being who had little more than the capacity to make tools and fire to distinguish him from the animals about him. Thus my point of view and that of the conventional historian are bound to be different. You will need both if you want to understand all of the story of men as they lived through time to the present. End of The Conquest of Civilization.
Chapter 10 of Prehistoric Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey. Prehistoric Men by Robert J. Braidwood. Chapter 10. End of Prehistory. You'll doubtless easily recall your general course in ancient history. How the Sumerian dynasties of Mesopotamia were supplanted by those of Babylonia, how the Hittite kingdom appeared in Anatolian Turkey, and about the three great phases of Egyptian history. The literate kingdom of Crete arose, and by 1500 BC there were splendid fortified Mycenaean towns on the mainland of Greece. This was the time, about the whole eastern end of the Mediterranean, of what Professor Breasted called the first great internationalism, with flourishing trade, international treaties, and royal marriages between Egyptians, Babylonians, and Hittites. By 1200 BC, the whole thing had fragmented. The peoples of the sea were restless in their isles, and the great ancient centers in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia were eclipsed. Numerous smaller states arose. Assyria, Phoenicia, Israel, and the Trojan War was fought. Finally, Assyria became the paramount power of all the Near East, presently to be replaced by Persia. A new culture, partaking of old West Asiatic and Egyptian elements, but casting them with its own tradition into a new mold, arose in mainland Greece. I once shocked my classical colleagues to the core by referring to Greece as a second-degree derived civilization. But there is much truth in this. The principles of bronze, and then of ironworking, of the alphabet, and of many other elements in Greek culture were borrowed from Western Asia. Our debt to the Greeks is too well known for me even to mention it, beyond recalling to you that it is to Greece we owe the beginnings of rational or empirical science and thought in general. But Greece fell in its turn to Rome, and in 55 BC Caesar invaded Britain. When I last spoke of Britain, I had chosen it as my single example for telling you something of how the earliest farming communities were established in Europe. Now I will continue with Britain's later prehistory, so you may sense something of the end of prehistory itself. Remember that Britain is simply a single example we select. The same thing could be done for all the other countries of Europe, and will be possible also some day for further Asia and Africa. Remember, too, that prehistory in most of Europe runs on for 3,000 or more years after conventional ancient history begins in the Near East. Britain is a good example to use in showing how prehistory ended in Europe. As we said earlier, it lies at the opposite end of Europe from the area of highest cultural achievement in those times, and should you care to read more of the story in detail, you may do so in the English language. Metal users reach England. We left the story of Britain with the peoples who made three different assemblages, the Windmill Hill, the megalith builders, and the Peterborough, making adjustments to their environments, to the original inhabitants of the island, and to each other. They had first arrived about 2500 BC and were simple pastoralists, and hoe cultivators who lived in little village communities. Some of them planted little, if any, grain. By 2000 BC, they were well settled in. Then, somewhere in the range from about 1900 to 1800 BC, the traces of the invasion of a new series of peoples began to appear. The first newcomers are called the Beaker folk, after the name of a peculiar form of pottery they made. The Beaker type of pottery seems oldest in Spain, where it occurs with great collective tombs of megalithic construction and with copper tools. But the Beaker folk who reached England seem already to have moved first from Spain to the Rhineland and Holland. While in the Rhineland and before leaving for England, the Beaker folk seem to have mixed with the local population and also with incomers from northeastern Europe, whose culture included elements brought originally from the Near East by the Eastern Way through the steppes. The last group has also been named for a peculiar article in its assemblage. The group is called the battle axe folk. A few battle axe folk elements, including, in fact, stone battle axes, reached England, with the earliest Beaker folk coming from the Rhineland. Footnote: the British authors use the term Beaker folk to mean both archaeological assemblage and human physical type. They speak of a tall, heavy-boned, rugged, and round-headed strain which they take to have developed, apparently in the Rhineland, by a mixture of the original, perhaps Spanish, beaker makers and the northeast European battle axe makers. However, since the science of physical anthropology is very much in flux at the moment, and since I am not able to assess the evidence for these physical types, I do not use the term folk in this book with its usual meaning of standardized physical type. When I use folk here, I mean simply the makers of a given archaeological assemblage. The difficulty only comes when assemblages are named for some item in them. It is too clumsy to make an adjective of the item and refer to a Beakerian assemblage. End of footnote. The Beaker folk settled earliest in the agriculturally fertile south and east. There seem to have been several phases of Beaker folk invasions, and it is not clear whether these all came strictly from the Rhineland or Holland. We do know that their copper daggers and awls and armlets are more of Irish or Atlantic European than of Rhineland origin. A few simple habitation sites and many burials of the Beaker folk are known. They buried their dead singly, sometimes in conspicuous individual barrows, with the dead warrior in his full trappings. The spectacular element in the assemblage of the Beaker folk is a group of large circular monuments with ditches and with uprights of wood or stone. These henges became truly monumental several hundred years later. While they were occasionally dedicated with a burial, they were not primarily tombs. The effect of the invasion of the Beaker folk seems to cut across the whole fabric of life in Britain. There was, however, a second major element in British life at this time. It shows itself in the less well understood traces of a group, again called after one of the items in their catalogue, the food vessel folk. There are many burials in these food vessel pots in northern England, Scotland, and Ireland, and the pottery itself seems to link back to that of the Peterborough assemblage. Like the earlier Peterborough people in the Highland zone before them, the makers of the food vessels seem to have been heavily involved in trade. It is quite proper to wonder whether the food vessel pottery itself was made by local women who were married to traders who were middlemen in the transmission of Irish metal objects to North Germany and Scandinavia. The belt of high, relatively woodless country from southwest to northeast was already established as a natural route for inland trade. More invasions. About 1500 BC, the situation became further complicated by the arrival of a new people in the region of southern England, anciently called Wessex. The traces suggest the Brittany coast of France as a source, and the people seem at first to have been a small but heroic group of aristocrats. Their heroes are buried with wealth and ceremony, surrounded by their axes and daggers of bronze, their gold ornaments, and amber and jet beads. These rich finds show that the trade linkage these warriors patronized spread from the Baltic sources of amber to Mycenaean Greece or even Egypt, as evidenced by glazed blue beads. The great visual trace of Wessex achievement is the final form of the spectacular sanctuary at Stonehenge. A wooden henge or circular monument was first made several hundred years earlier, but the site now received its great circles of stone uprights and lintels. The diameter of the surrounding ditch at Stonehenge is about 350 feet. The diameter of the inner circle of large stones is about 100 feet, and the tallest stone of the innermost horseshoe-shaped enclosure is 29 feet 8 inches high. One circle is made of blue stones which must have been transported from Pembrokeshire, 145 miles away as the crow flies. Recently, many carvings representing the profile of a standard type of bronze axe of the time and several profiles of bronze daggers, one of which has been called Mycenaean in type, have been found carved in the stones. We cannot, of course, describe the details of the religious ceremonies which must have been staged in Stonehenge, but we can certainly imagine the well-integrated and smoothly working culture which must have been necessary before such a great monument could have been built. This England. The range from 1900 to about 1400 BC includes the time of development of the archaeological features usually called the Early Bronze Age in Britain. In fact, traces of the Wessex warriors persisted down to about 1200 BC. The main regions of the island were populated, and the adjustments to the highland and lowland zones were distinct and well marked. The different aspects of the assemblages of the Beaker folk and the clearly expressed activities of the food vessel folk and the Wessex warriors show that Britain was already taking on her characteristic trading role, separated from the European continent but conveniently adjacent to it. The tin of Cornwall, so important in the production of good bronze, as well as the copper of the west and of Ireland, taken with the gold of Ireland and the general excellence of Irish metalwork, assured Britain a trader's place in the then known world. Contacts with the eastern Mediterranean may have been by sea, with Cornish tin as the attraction, or may have been made by the food vessel middlemen on their trips to the Baltic coast. There they would have encountered traders who traveled the great north-south European road by which Baltic amber moved southward to Greece and the Levant, and ideas and things moved northward again. There was, however, the channel between England and Europe, and this relative isolation gave some peace and also gave time for a leveling and further fusion of culture. The separate cultural traditions began to have more in common. The growing of barley, the herding of sheep and cattle, and the production of woolen garments were already features common to all Britain's inhabitants save a few in the remote highlands, the far north, and the distant islands not yet fully touched by food production. The personality of Britain was being formed. Cremation burials begin. Along with people of certain religious faiths, archaeologists are against cremation for other people. Individuals to be cremated seem in past times to have been dressed in their trappings and put upon a large pyre. It takes a lot of wood and a very hot fire for a thorough cremation. When the burning had been completed, the few fragile scraps of bone and such odd beads of stone or other rare items as had resisted the great heat seem to have been whisked into a pot and the pot buried. The archaeologist is left with the pot and the unsatisfactory scraps in it. Tentatively, after about 1400 BC, and almost completely over the whole island by 1200 BC, Britain became the scene of cremation burials in urns. We know very little of the people themselves. None of their settlements have been identified, although there is evidence that they grew barley and made enclosures for cattle. The urns used for the burial seems to have antecedents in the pottery of the food vessel folk, and there are some other links with earlier British traditions. In Lancashire, a wooden circle seems to have been built about a grave with cremated burials in urns. Even occasional instances of cremation may be noticed earlier in Britain, and it is not clear what, if any, connection the British cremation burials in urns have with the classic urn fields which were now beginning in the East Mediterranean and which we shall mention below. The British cremation burial in urns folk survived a long time in the Highland zone. In the general British scheme, they make up what is called the Middle Bronze Age, but in the Highland zone they last until after 900 BC and are considered to be a specialized Highland Late Bronze Age. In the Highland zone, these later cremation burial folk seem to have continued the older food vessel tradition of being middlemen in the metal market. Granting that our knowledge of this phase of British prehistory is very restricted because the cremations have left so little for the archaeologist, it does not appear that the cremation burial urn folk can be sharply set off from their immediate predecessors, but change on a grander scale was on the way. Reverberations from Central Europe. In the centuries immediately following 1000 BC, we see with fair clarity two phases of the cultural process which must have been going on for some time. Certainly several of the invasions we have already described in this chapter were due to earlier phases of the same cultural process, but we could not see the details. Around 1200 BC, Central Europe was upset by the spread of the so-called Urnfield folk, who practiced cremation burial in urns and whom we also know to have been possessors of long slashing swords and the horse. I told you above that we have no idea that the Urnfield folk proper were in any way connected with the people who made cremation burial urn cemeteries a century or so earlier in Britain. It has been supposed that the Urnfield folk themselves may have shared ideas with the people who sacked Troy. We know that the Urnfield pressure from Central Europe displaced other people in northern France and perhaps in northwestern Germany, and that this reverberated into Britain about 1000 BC. Soon after 750 BC, the same thing happened again. This time, the pressure from Central Europe came from the Hallstatt folk, who were iron tool makers. The reverberation brought people from the western Alpine region across the Channel into Britain. At first, it is possible to see the separate results of these folk movements, but the developing cultures soon fused with each other and with earlier British elements. Presently, there were also strains of other northern and western European pottery and traces of Urnfield practices themselves which appeared in the finished British product. I hope you will sense that I am vastly oversimplifying the details. The result seems to have been, among other things, a new kind of agricultural system. The land was marked off by ditched divisions. Rectangular fields imply the plow rather than hoe cultivation. We seem to get a picture of estate or tribal boundaries, which included village communities. We find a variety of tools in bronze and even whetstones which show that iron has been honed on them, although the scarce iron has not been found. Let me give you the picture in Professor S. Piggot's words. Quote, "The late Bronze Age of southern England was but the forerunner of the earliest Iron Age in the same region, not only in the techniques of agriculture, but almost certainly in terms of ethnic kinship. We can, with some assurance, talk of the Celts. The great early Celtic expansion of the continent is recognized to be that of the Urnfield people." End quote. Thus, certainly by 500 BC, there were people in Britain, some of whose descendants we may recognize today in name or language in remote parts of Wales, Scotland, and the Hebrides. The coming of iron. Iron, once the know-how of producing it from its ore in a very hot, closed fire has been achieved, produces a far cheaper and much more efficient set of tools than does bronze. Iron tools seem first to have been made in quantity in Hittite Anatolia about 1500 BC. In continental Europe, the earliest so-called Hallstatt iron-using cultures appeared in Germany soon after 750 BC. Somewhat later, Greek and especially Etruscan exports of objets d'art, which moved with a flourishing transalpine wine trade, influenced the Hallstatt ironworking tradition. Still later, new classical motifs, together with older Hallstatt, Oriental, and Northern nomad motifs, gave rise to a new style in metal decoration which characterizes the so-called Latin phase. A few iron users reached Britain a little before 400 BC. Not long after that, a number of allied groups appeared in southern and southeastern England. They came over the Channel from France and must have been Celts with dialects related to those already in England. A second wave of Celts arrived from the Marne district in France about 250 BC. Finally, in the second quarter of the first century BC, there were several groups of newcomers, some of whom were Belgae of a mixed Teutonic Celtic confederacy of tribes in northern France and Belgium. The Belgae preceded the Romans by only a few years. Hill forts and farms. The earliest iron users seem to have entrenched themselves temporarily within hilltop forts, mainly in the south. Gradually, they moved inland, establishing individual farm sites with extensive systems of rectangular fields. We recognize these fields by the lynchets, or lines of soil creep which plowing left on the slopes of hills. New crops appeared. There were now bread wheats, oats, and rye, as well as barley. At Little Woodbury, near the town of Salisbury, a farmstead has been rather completely excavated. The rustic buildings were within a palisade, the round house itself was built of wood, and there were various outbuildings and pits for the storage of grain. Weaving was done on the farm, but not blacksmithing, which must have been a specialized trade. Save for the lack of firearms, the place might almost be taken for a farmstead on the American frontier in the early 1800s. Toward 250 BC, there seems to have been a hasty attempt to repair the hill forts and to build new ones, evidently in response to signs of restlessness being shown by remote relatives in France. The second phase. Perhaps the hill forts were not entirely effective, or perhaps a compromise was reached. In any case, the newcomers from the Marne district did establish themselves first in the southeast and then to the north and west. They brought iron with decoration of the Latin type and also the two-wheeled chariot. Like the Wessex warriors of over 1,000 years earlier, they made heroes' graves with their warrior buried in the war chariots and dressed in full trappings. The metal work of these Marnian newcomers is excellent. The peculiar Celtic art style, based originally on the classic tendril motif, is colorful and virile and fits with Greek and Roman descriptions of Celtic love of color in dress. There is a strong trace of these newcomers northward in Yorkshire, linked by Ptolemy's description to the Parisii, doubtless part of the Celtic tribe which originally gave its name to Paris on the Seine. Near Glastonbury, in Somerset, two villages in swamps have been excavated. They seem to date toward the middle of the 1st century BC, which was a troubled time in Britain. The circular houses were built on timber platforms surrounded with palisades. The preservation of antiquities by the waterlogged peat of the swamp has yielded us a long catalogue of the materials of these villagers. In Scotland, which yields its first iron tools at a date of about 100 BC, and in Northern Ireland even slightly earlier, the effects of the two phases of newcomers tend especially to blend. Hill forts, brochs, stone-built round towers, and a variety of other strange structures seem to appear as the new ideas develop in the comparative isolation of northern Britain. The third phase. For the time of about the middle of the 1st century BC, we again see traces of frantic hill fort construction. The simple military architecture now took some new forms. Its multiple ramparts must reflect the use of slings as missiles rather than spears. We probably know the reason. In 56 BC, Julius Caesar chastised the Veneti of Brittany for outraging the dignity of Roman ambassadors. The Veneti were famous slingers, and doubtless the reverberations of escaping Veneti were felt across the Channel. The military architecture suggests that some Veneti did escape to Britain. Also, through Caesar, we learned the names of newcomers who arrived in two waves, about 75 BC and about 50 BC. These were the Belgi. Now at last we can even begin to speak of dynasties and individuals. Sometime before 55 BC, the Catouelloni, originally from the Marne district in France, had possessed themselves of a large part of southeastern England. They evidently sailed up the Thames and built a town of over 100 acres in area. Here ruled Cassivellaunus, the first man in England whose name we know, and whose town Caesar sacked. The town sprang up elsewhere again, however. The end of prehistory. Prehistory, strictly speaking, is now over in southern Britain. Claudius's effective invasion took place in 43 AD. By 83 AD, a raid had been made as far north as Aberdeen in Scotland, but by 127 AD, Hadrian had completed his wall from the Solway to the Tyne, and the Romans settled behind it. In Scotland, Romanization can have affected the countryside very little. Professor Piggott adds that, quote, "It is when the pressure of Romanization is relaxed by the breakup of the Dark Ages that we see again the Celtic metalsmiths handling the material with the same consummate skill as they had before the Roman conquest, and with traditional styles that had not even then forgotten their Marnian and Belgic heritage." End quote. In fact, many centuries go by in Britain as well as in the rest of Europe before the archaeologist's task is complete and the historian on his own is able to describe the ways of men in the past. Britain as a sample of the general course of prehistory in Europe. In giving this very brief outline of the later prehistory of Britain, you will have noticed how often I had to refer to the European continent itself. Britain, beyond the English Channel for all of her later prehistory, had a much simpler course of events than did most of the rest of Europe in later prehistoric times. This holds in spite of all the invasions and reverberations from the continent. Most of Europe was the scene of an even more complicated ebb and flow of cultural change, save in some of its more remote mountain valleys and peninsulas. The whole course of later prehistory in Europe is, in fact, so very complicated that there is no single good book to cover it all. Certainly there is none in English. There are some good regional accounts and some good general accounts of part of the range from about 3000 BC to AD 1. I suspect that the difficulty of making a good book that covers all of its later prehistory is another aspect of what makes Europe so very complicated a continent today. The prehistoric foundations for Europe's very complicated set of civilizations, cultures, and subcultures which begin to appear as history proceeds were in themselves very complicated. Hence, I selected the case of Britain as a single example of how prehistory ends in Europe. It could have been more complicated than we found it to be. Even in the subject matter on Britain, in the chapter before the last, we did not see direct traces of the effect on Britain of the very important developments that took place in the Danubian Way from the Near East. Apparently, Britain was not affected. Britain received the impulses which brought copper, bronze, and iron tools from an original East Mediterranean homeland into Europe, almost at the ends of their journeys. But by the same token, they had had time en route to take on their characteristic European aspects. Some time ago, Sir Cyril Fox wrote a famous book called The Personality of Britain, subtitled, quote, "Its Influence on Inhabitant and Invader in Prehistoric and Early Historic Times." End quote. We have not gone into the post-Roman early historic period here. There are still the Anglo-Saxons and Normans to account for as well as the effects of the Romans. But what I have tried to do was to begin the story of how the personality of Britain was formed. The principles that Fox used in trying to balance cultural and environmental factors and interrelationships would not be greatly different for other lands. End of chapter 10. End of Prehistory. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey. Chapter 11 of Prehistoric Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey. Prehistoric Men by Robert J. Braidwood. Chapter 11. Summary. In the pages you have read so far, you've been brought through the earliest 99% of the story of man's life on this planet. I have left only 1% of the story for the historians to tell. The drama of the past. Men first became men when evolution had carried them to a certain point. This was the point where the eye-hand-brain coordination was good enough so that tools could be made. When tools began to be made according to sets of lasting habits, we know that men had appeared. This happened over 500,000 years ago. The stage for the play may have been as broad as all of Europe, Africa, and Asia. At least it seems unlikely that it was only one little region that saw the beginning of the drama. Glaciers in different climates came and went to change the settings, but the play went on in the same first act for a very long time. The men who were the players had simple roles. They had to feed themselves and protect themselves as best as they could. They did this by hunting, catching, and finding food wherever they could, and by taking such protection as caves, fire, and the simple tools would give them. Before the first act was over, the last of the glaciers was melting away, and the players added the new world to their stage. If we want a special name for the first act, we could call it the Food Gatherers. There were not many climaxes in the first act so far as we can see, but I think there may have been a few. Certainly the pace of the first act accelerated with a swing from simple gathering to more intensified collecting. The great cave art of France and Spain was probably an expression of a climax. Even the ideas of burying the dead and of the Venus figurines must also point to levels of human thought and activity that were over and above pure food-getting. The second act. The second act began only about 10,000 years ago. A few of the players started it by themselves near the center of the Old World part of the stage in the Near East. It began as a plant and animal act, but it soon became much more complicated. But the players in this one part of the stage, in the Near East, were not the only ones to start off on the second act by themselves. Other players, possibly in several places in the Far East, and certainly in the New World, also started second acts that began as plant and animal acts and then became complicated. We can call the whole second act as the food producers. The first great climax of the second act. In the Near East, the first marked climax of the second act happened in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The play and the players reached that great climax that we call civilization. This seems to have come less than 5,000 years after the second act began, but it could never have happened in the first act at all. There is another curious thing about the first act. Many of the players didn't know it was over, and they kept on with their roles long after the second act had begun. On the edges of the stage, there are today some players who are still going on with the first act. The Eskimos and the native Australians and certain tribes in the Amazon jungle are some of these players. They seem perfectly happy to keep on with the first act. The second act moved from climax to climax. The civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt were only the earliest of these climaxes. The players to the west caught the spirit of the thing, and climaxes followed there. So also did climaxes come in the Far Eastern and New World portions of the stage. The greater part of the second act should really be described to you by a historian. Although it was a very short act when compared to the first one, the climaxes complicated a great deal. I, a prehistorian, have told you about only the first act and the very beginning of the second. The third act. Also, as a prehistorian, I probably should not even mention the third act. It began so recently. The third act is the industrialization. It is the one in which we ourselves are players. If the pace of the second act was so much faster than that of the first, the pace of the third act is terrific. The danger is that it may wear down the players completely. What sort of climaxes will the third act have, and are we already in one? You have seen by now that the acts of my play are given in terms of modes or basic patterns of human economy, ways in which people get food and protection and safety. The climaxes involve more than human economy. Economics and technological factors may be part of the climaxes, but they are not all. The climaxes may be revolutions in their own way, intellectual and social revolutions, if you like. If the third act follows the pattern of the second act, a climax should come soon after the act begins. We may be due for one soon if we are not already in it. Remember the terrific pace of this third act. Why bother with prehistory? Why do we bother about prehistory? The main reason is that we think it may point to useful ideas for the present. We are in the troublesome beginnings of the third act of the play. The beginnings of the second act may have lessons for us and give depth to our thinking. I know there are at least some lessons, even in the present incomplete state of our knowledge. The players who began the second act, that of food production separately in different parts of the world, were not all of one pure race, nor did they have pure cultural traditions. Some apparently quite mixed Mediterraneans got off the first start of the second act and brought it to its first two climaxes as well. People of quite different physical type achieved the first climaxes in China and in the New World. In our British example of how the late prehistory of Europe worked, we listed a continuous series of invasions and reverberations. After each of these came fusion. Even though the Channel protected Britain from some of the extreme complications of the mixture and fusion of continental Europe, you can see how silly it would be to refer to a pure British race or a pure British culture. We speak of the United States as a melting pot, but this is nothing new. Actually, Britain and all the rest of the world have been melting pots at one time or another. By the time the written records of Mesopotamia and Egypt begin to turn up in number, the climaxes there are well underway. To understand the beginnings of the climaxes and the real beginnings of the second act itself, we are thrown back on prehistoric archaeology. And this is as true for China, India, Middle America, and the Andes as it is for the Near East. There are lessons to be learned from all of man's past, not simply lessons of how to fight battles or win peace conferences, but of how human society evolves from one stage to another. Many of these lessons can only be looked for in the prehistoric past. So far, we have only made a beginning. There is much still to do, and many gaps in the story are yet to be filled. The prehistorian's job is to find the evidence, to fill the gaps, and to discover the lessons men have learned in the past. As I see it, this is not only an exciting but a very practical goal for which to strive. End of Chapter 11. Summary. End of Prehistoric Men by Robert J. Braidwood. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey.